the month of Adar, I'll begin with a joke. In honor of my recent visit to the Vatican, I'll draw from the collection of jokes about Jews and the Pope. The most often told story is called The Great Debate, and it is completely fiction. 500 years ago, the Pope decreed that all the Jews had to convert to Catholicism or leave Italy. There was a huge outcry from the Jewish community, and so the Pope agreed to hold a religious debate with a rabbi of their choice. And if the rabbi won the public disputation, then they could stay in Italy, and if the Pope won, then they would have to find their way. The Jewish people met an aged, wise rabbi and chose him to represent them in the debate. But because the rabbi spoke no Latin, both the Pope and the rabbi agreed that this would be a silent debate. On the chosen day, the Pope and the rabbi stood opposite one another in the public square in the piazza, and everyone gathered to watch. Everyone knew that the stakes were high. So first, the Pope raised his hand to show 3 fingers, and the rabbi looked back and raised 1. Next, the Pope raised his finger and waved it above his head, all around. And then the rabbi pointed to the ground. The Pope then took out the communion wafer and a chalice of wine, and the rabbi took out an apple. And with that, the Pope declared that he had been defeated, that the rabbi's theological disputes were indisputable, and that the Jews could remain. The crowd gasped, and the Jews were elated. Later, the cardinals gathered around the Pope, and they asked him, "What happened? What happened in that plaza?" And the Pope explained, "First, I held up 3 fingers to represent the Trinity. And then the rabbi responded with a single finger, reminding me that there is one God common to both of our faiths. And then I waved my finger around my head to show that God rules from above, from heaven above. And then the rabbi pointed to the ground, asserting that God is also right here with us. I then took out the wine and the wafer to show that God absolves us of all our sins, and then the rabbi took out the apple to remind me of our original sin. He bested me at every turn, and so I could not continue." Meanwhile, the Jewish community gathered around the rabbi to ask him, "What happened? How did you win the great debate with the learned Pope?" And the rabbi said, "I haven't a clue." First, he told me that we had 3 days to get out of Italy. And so I raised my hand and I said, "No, we are not going anywhere." And then he waved his finger all around to threaten that the whole country would be cleared of the Jewish people. And so I pointed to the ground and I told him, "We're not going anywhere. We're going to stay right here." "And then what?" they asked. "I have no idea," the rabbi said. "He took out his lunch and I took out mine." Okay, forgive me, it's a terrible joke. But Purim is coming. So, speaking of the stories we tell, people have been asking, so tell us, what did you learn at the Vatican? So it was very interesting. I learned a lot. I went as a delegation of the Alphabet Soup. The organization is called IJCIC, IJCIC, the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations. This is the umbrella Jewish organization that is designed to maintain and develop relationships between global Jewry and the Vatican and the Orthodox Christian Church and the World Council of Churches and other international religious bodies. So by virtue of my vice presidency position, VP of Organizational Relationships with the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, I was invited to join IJCIC for its annual visit to the Vatican. And it really was an honor, and as I said, it was eye-opening for me. So it was just the week after the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And you may have read that Pope Francis met with a delegation then from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And he said all the things we were longing to hear. He said, if we lose our memory, we annihilate the future. Pope Francis said, may the anniversary of the unspeakable cruelty that humanity learned 75 years ago serve as a summons to pause, to be silent, and to remember. We need to do this lest we become indifferent. And I could tell that the Pope's words set the tone for the series of meetings that the IJKIC delegation had just the week following. There were 13 of us. We were there for 2.5 days. We were Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative rabbis, Jewish scholars of early Christianity, Jewish leaders from Jewish communal organizations like the World Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League and American Jewish Committee. We came from Israel, from Great Britain, from the United States. I was the only Canadian representative. IJKIC's board also includes representatives from South America and Australia. And we met with 7 cardinals and archbishops and other men of importance, voices of the Vatican and the Catholic Church. And each one, in one way or another, showed that he had integrated the message of the Pope from just the week before. They had fully appreciated this clear approach to the relationship, the historic relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people. The Pope had said, even recently we have witnessed a barbaric resurgence of anti-Semitism. I do not tire of firmly condemning every form of anti-Semitism. However, in order to address the problem at its root, we must commit ourselves to tilling the soil in which hatred grows, sowing peace in it. So we expressed our gratitude at every chance for the Pope's call for deeper Christian-Jewish cooperation and respect for human dignity. We thanked the Pope for saying that every person is due in equal measure, regardless of his or her ethnic origin, religion, or social status, the benefit of human dignity. It is extremely important to teach tolerance and mutual understanding, freedom of religion, and the promotion of social peace, he said. So we do not take these things for granted. Across the backdrop of the history of Jews and Rome, these words were astoundingly praiseworthy. Throughout the trip, I was fully mindful of the incredible highs and the terrifying lows of Jewish history, which came at the word of and at the hand of the Church. The record of the history of Jews in Italy actually begins in 161 BCE when 2 envoys of Judah Maccabee were first sent to travel to Rome. So let me share just one window of 35 years from this long history of Jews in Italy. I've randomly selected the 35 years from 1531 to 1565, just to show you the range of the highs and the lows of this history. In 1531, we have the earliest known Jewish play in all of Europe. It was a Purim play, and it was put on in the Venice ghetto at a time when plays of biblical themes were popular across Europe. In 1535, the great sage Abravanel writes his dialogues about love while living in Rome. This Neoplatonic treatise was written by Abravanel, a leading philosopher of the Renaissance, and his influence goes beyond Jewish circles. In 1541, the Venetian Senate invites Jews from the Levant to come and reside in Venice. They actually sought them out to stimulate commerce in Venice. And Elijah Levita publishes a Hebrew grammar book explaining Hebrew words using very often translation in Latin, which goes to show that there was great cross-cultural knowledge. And in that very year of 1541, the Jews of Naples were expelled, not to be readmitted until 1735. In 1551, Grand Duke of Tuscany issues a charter to attract Sephardic Jewish merchants to come from the Balkans, and they did. In 1553, convinced that the Talmud was included attacks against Christianity, Pope Julius III burned thousands of volumes of the Talmud publicly in Rome and in Bologna and in Mantua and in Venice and in Ferrara. In 1559, Pope Paul IV places the Talmud on a list of banned books. That same year, Pope Paul IV permits the printing of the Zohar, however, a book of Jewish medieval mysticism. At the same time that he's burning 12,000 other Jewish books, he thinks that this one does not contain any anti-Christian statements, and so it can remain. And finally, in 1565, I'll end with a high point of Jewish life where Joseph Caro prints the Shulchan Aruch, the primary canon code of Jewish law, printed in Venice. So these are just a few examples in just a blink of an eye, 35 years, in one small corner of the Jewish world, where things change on a dime. And so many truths are true simultaneously. So many truths are expressed and experienced all at the same time. And we too often forget this. We think of history as black and white. There were good days and bad days. There were days of light and days of darkness, periods of openness and advancement, and days of restriction and darkness. But it's not so. It's not that way. We see it in our own time. We see how truths can play out all at once. There are anti-Semitic acts here, there, and everywhere, in the underground of the dark and deep internet, and in the open and festive parades of Belgium and Spain. And at the same time, just this week in Ontario, there was a unanimous vote that against anti-Semitism and defining anti-Semitism so that we can fight it better. And we enjoy freedoms and friendships never known so widely or so sincerely in all of Jewish history. The fact that 2 of the Democratic candidates are Jewish is just astounding, and that the seated president has Jewish grandchildren. So we see that both things are true today as they have always been true. So let me share with you a few of the things that we heard. And some of them are timely. Our last visit was with the chief archivist of the Vatican. We went to visit the Vatican archives, and there we met with the person who was in charge of organizing them. Now, you may know that the archives of Pope Pius XII have been sealed for all these years. He was the Pope from 1939 to 1958, and the Church has been silent in explaining what was his role during those years when the Jews were systematically annihilated. And when Pope Francis came into position from his background in Argentina, where he saw firsthand how secrecy and corruption can lead to such dangerous ways, he said, "Open those sealed archives. Let us know the truth about that time of Pope Pius XII." And so the archivists have been preparing. And this week coming, we will begin to hear what is found by the select group of scholars who have been handpicked and welcomed to be the first ones to study this collection of material. Among those scholars are representatives from Hebrew University, representatives from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and representatives also of the Jewish community of Rome. Because you remember, we have eyewitness accounts of Jews who were taken from the ghetto and carted off in wagons by the roadside in eyeshot of the Vatican. And they deserve to know what was said and what was not said, what was known and what was not known. So I urge you to follow that story in the coming weeks. In the coming weeks and months, we'll be learning more and more. We also met, there's so many stories to tell. I'll choose just two more, I think. One was with Cardinal Sandry, who is the prefect of the Congregation for Oriental Churches, which includes all the churches in Israel. And he had just returned from Israel, was part of the delegation of the world leaders who went for the memorial ceremonies at Yad Vashem to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day. And he spoke about how important it is that the church see that the holy places are maintained by Israel, by the government of Israel, and of course, since its founding in 1948, the State of Israel has made that a promise and has stood by that promise. He spoke specifically about a recent effort to make sure that the Jordan River was clean for baptisms. And then he shifted to talk about the goal of peace in religious terms. And he made a personal comment that Jews are so intelligent in every aspect of society, in the arts and in sciences and in business and philosophy. And he said, "You have made Israel a garden, and so because of your intelligences, I am sure that you will find a way to bring peace to Israel." If only it were so easy. And really a highlight for me was the privilege to meet Cardinal Koch, who comes from Switzerland. He is the president of the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. And he is learned in his own scriptures and in texts of the Jewish people. And he is warm, and he is kind. And he reminded us how Pope Francis teaches the entire Catholic world that it is impossible to be Christian and anti-Semitic at the same time. And he urged us to consider how we might, religious leaders, go from having two monologues to having one dialogue. He says, oftentimes when rabbis and priests or bishops get together, as I do here in Canada, we have respectful, parallel conversations where one makes a statement about itself and its own reading of scripture and history, and then the other. And we nod, and we shake hands, and we break bread together, and it feels good. But Cardinal Koch says it should be more than that. We must be able to write joint statements together that come as a product of deep conversations that we share. He said, for example, you are people of God with a special and unique covenant with God. And at the same time, I believe that Christians have something new, that Jesus brought a new covenant. And so how do we reconcile these, we Catholics, we Christians? He said, I don't know. I cannot find an answer alone. I need you to talk it through with me, to help me understand how both of these tenets of my faith can be held together. So let me conclude with a reflection that came at the end of our time together from Betty Ehrenberg, who is the Executive Director of World Jewish Congress of North America. She's been making these trips to the Vatican for many years now. And she says, today we are speaking power to power. And this is altogether different. This is altogether new. When we come to the Vatican and the cardinals give us of their time and they open their doors to us so graciously, this is a recognition of power speaking to power, truth to truth. And we learned how to advocate for ourselves. In 1967, she says, we learned how to be powerful. And we learned never again to allow hatred to creep into the pulpits throughout the world. And so we could say to the head of the communication system of the Catholic Church, there are 650 professionals working on communications throughout the church. We could say to the head of them, would you please make sure that this radio station, which is known for saying hateful things about the Jews, can be corrected. We could speak power to power. In just a moment, we're going to rise to our feet for the Aleinu prayer. And we will begin the prayer by praising God for our distinct character, our distinct family, our distinct history, our distinct theology, and yes, our distinct destiny as well. About this, Rabbi Leo Beck said, every people can be chosen for a history, for a share in the history of humanity. Each is a question which God has asked, and each people must answer. But it seems more history has been assigned to this people, the Jewish people, than any other. God's question speaks stronger here with us. The word of the one God penetrated this people from its beginning. When the commandment of God awakes in humankind, freedom also opens its eyes. And where freedom commences, there history begins. And we will then conclude our Aleinu prayer with the famous vision of the prophet Zechariah. Bayom hahu yihiyeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. One day the eternal God shall rule over all the earth, over all humanity, and on that day God shall be one, and God's name shall be one. Amen.